Hi, I'm Liv.
I'm Tia.
And I'm Ben.
And this is our Thematic Learning Objective Review Project.
So our theme is National Identity 4.0, analyze relationships among different regional, social, ethnic, and racial groups, and explain how these groups' experiences have related to U.S. national identity. Complex race relations have played a significant role in American national identity since before it even became its own country. Bacon's Rebellion was a major turning point in that it ended indentured servitude of British whites and racialized slavery. After 1676, whites were considered inherently superior to blacks socially, economically, and politically. The Pueblo Revolt around the same time outlined the clear distinctions between Native Americans and settling whites. While much progress is made throughout the rest of American history, there are patterns of progress and setbacks that define race relations. Here we are going to focus on how whites have interacted with African Americans and Native Americans throughout history, because those most significantly impacted American national identity. So let's start off with African American relations. Race relations intensified after Bacon's Rebellion due to the harsh, oppressive treatment of slaves in the colonies. This treatment was accepted until awareness finally began to spread in the early 19th century with significant texts such as David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Despite these efforts to change the status quo in America, the power of racism was enforced by the results of the Dred Scott v. Sanford decision in 1857. Maintaining slaves as property and denying them access to citizenship. Another similar example of the progression and regression pairing was in 1865, with the end of the Civil War and the ratification of the 13th Amendment. While this appears to be an immense step in the right direction for blacks, Southern states simultaneously began to pass black codes which restricted any rights of blacks. Sharecropping also began in response to slavery becoming illegal, diminishing the success of the supposed legislative process. While the ratification amendments should have guaranteed freedom, equal citizenship, and voting rights for blacks, the subsequent developments included the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, Plessy v. Ferguson, and support of the racist film Birth of a Nation. This shows that the race relations between African Americans and whites have always been very tense, conflicting, and even violent at times. The middle of the 20th century demonstrates the same pattern of opposite effects occurring between races. The Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education, along with nonviolent protests across the country, such as the Montgomery bus boycotts, were unprecedented examples of hope and progress for African Americans. Despite this progress, the murder of an innocent boy named Emmett Till evidenced the ever-present racism in America. While patterns of progression alongside regression have continued into today, it is sure that race relations have softened as the majority of blacks and whites have learned to cooperate and respect one another as Americans and see the humanity in one another rather than the color of their skin. Moving on to relations between Native Americans and whites. This relationship has been less significant in shaping American national identity because there has been less successful pushback from that minority group when compared to African Americans. The Pueblo Revolt represents an early violent conflict between these two groups, ultimately failing to alter the power dynamic between colonists and natives. Most of the main developments with Native American relations are examples of whites demonstrating their power and superiority over natives. The oppressive Trail of Tears is one example of policymakers' disregard of justice for natives. Strength in numbers has also shaped this relationship because the comparatively small population of natives made it difficult for their voices to be heard. Ever since the Wounded Knee Massacre that extinguished any hope of sovereignty for Native Americans, they have been a largely unheard group of people in the nation. While the American Indian movement began in 1968 and continues on to today, it has a relatively small prevalence in political developments and has not contributed greatly to the national identity. Overall, long-time tension between progressive reform and assertion of white superiority have defined what it means to be an American. The complex history of race relations shows the diversity and divisiveness of the United States, but it is also a key demonstrator of how our ideals and values have benevolently evolved as a result of progressive movements and push for reform.
Relations among different social groups have changed throughout history as these groups shift and change themselves. I split up some of what I believe to be the most important or largest groups into two different categories, those having to do with religion and those having to do with oppressed minorities. There are obviously more movements that are just as important and relevant as the ones I've included, but I found these especially helpful in analyzing how their experiences have contributed to a national identity. Starting with religious movements, it's easy to tell that religion has always played a large part in American national identity. Beginning with the Puritans during colonization, although that's before the time periods we focused on here, the country was founded with religion being a large part of society and continued throughout American history. Continuities include different awakenings that show a revival of the religion, but these can also show changes. For example, the Second Great Awakening placed an emphasis on human free will and social reform, a sort of liberal religion, whereas the First Great Awakening emphasized a personal relationship with God. Then, once we get closer to the 19th and 20th centuries, we see a shift towards accepting more types of religions, such as Judaism during the Zion movement. There's a slight change with the secular movement, but ultimately religious groups' advocation of divinity or a higher power has pretty much remained constant throughout U.S. history, despite changes in how or why they do this. And the fact that most of these movements are Christian movements shows an identity deeply rooted in one broader religion. As for the next section, I think this shows a commitment to social change as a part of American society. The relations between these groups also shows a mutual effort for betterment of society. For example, women's rights and civil rights activists often fought hand in hand, especially towards the beginning of the period of social change, due to the fact that both of these groups felt oppressed and their voices could be better heard in larger numbers. Movements often piggybacked off of each other to create progress through momentum, which shows a theme of collaboration. Even though it took quite a while for women, Black Americans, and other oppressed groups to gain these deserved rights, this shows that even though America has a history of racism and sexism, social betterment and equality is a huge part of the United States' national identity. One key difference, though, is how feminism was much more of a gradual win, beginning in the 1800s, whereas civil rights advocates couldn't even begin until the 13th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting slavery in 1865, and it still took much longer for Americans to even recognize the civil rights struggle and for this movement to really gain momentum. All in all, relationships between social movements and the presence of these movements tell us a lot about an American national identity through the years. Through betterment of society, collaboration, and a common theme linking many Americans, a national identity was formed with the help of many social groups.
Now we are going to move on to regional differences and events. Regional differences have played a major defining role in the development of American history, especially when looking at the different development patterns of the North and South. All the way back to looking at the development of the Virginia colony as a tobacco-based cash crop colony versus the North's development as a Puritan family farming-based society, you can see the original split of the North and South regionally. There are examples of compromise and attempts at patching these regional differences. None more obvious early on than the Missouri Compromise, which was warned by Thomas Jefferson as dividing the North and South. This is really one of the first main events that set up these regional differences as becoming a major causality of the Civil War. With the South relying heavily on slavery and the North industrializing faster, the regional differences became more and more apparent in the mid-1800s, especially with the growth of westward expansion and the questions about what to do with slavery in new states. Regional differences, both socially and economically, and mainly over slavery, led to the Civil War, but did not stop there. Through Reconstruction, you can see the split between the North and South, and even after Reconstruction ends, you can see the resentment the South holds towards the North. The North versus South split is not the only regional split in this country. It is just the most notable due to the prevalence of the Civil War. There is also a notable split from the West and Midwest to the East, up until the railroad and canal systems are built. The regional divides in this country are mainly cultural and geographical. In conclusion, the regional differences between mainly the North and South set up social debates for decades, led into the Civil War, and still infect our society today. The regional differences that define America are essential to understanding our history as a nation of many different societies under one name. The push and pull of different regional identities is one of the things that makes American national identity so unique and has been a major factor in the creation of political parties.
The history of immigrants and diverse ethnic backgrounds in America is central to understanding the development of our societies. The first settlers in America are technically the first wave of immigrants, which mostly came from England and other parts of Western Europe. This was the first main wave of ethnicities that came and settled this land. As more immigrants came in the late 1700s, America passed the Naturalization Act, allowing people born in the United States from immigrant families to be considered American citizens. This is a huge stepping stone as it sets up the basis for later waves of immigrants to cement themselves as American citizens and to play a role in our national identity. In early to mid 1800s, we see the second wave of immigrants come through, mostly from Ireland, Italy, and Germany. This group of immigrants came at such a time during the Industrial Revolution that they were central to the growth of the American economy. Around this time is where we start to see the idea of America being a melting pot, which is exasperated to a greater extent with the start of Ellis Island and the coming of the third wave of immigrants from Eastern Europe. Although America is defined by the mixture of different ethnicities, there's been some struggle over the admittance of minorities into our country with movements like the Know Nothing Party. There are also certain bills and acts that have been passed to limit immigration. In terms of creating a national identity, the multitude of different ethnicities and cultures is a massive defining factor to the way our society has developed. Immigrants played a huge role in the development economically and culturally through the periods we have studied. The melting pot ideal is one of the ideas at the forefront of American national identity, and for a good reason. American culture has developed through multiple ethnicities over the course of our history, and especially through the Industrial Revolution. And development of different racial, social, regional, and ethnic groups has contributed to a complex, ever-changing national identity.
Adios!